I've been a software developer and consultant for over 11 years now, and if I could make one broad, sweeping, and perhaps unfair but not entirely unsubstantiated generalization about the industry, it would go something like this. Too many career project managers are inadequately performing a job that the developers themselves could and should be doing. The management of scope, risk, and expectations is an essential undertaking for anyone running a software project. With the right tools and just enough social skills, and perhaps the right philosophical underpinnings, it's my assessment that at least a small to medium-sized development team can self-manage successfully and eliminate middle management interference. I'm building MVPM tools to help software delivery professionals achieve just that and become minimum viable project managers. It's 100% free with no strings attached. In this video, I'll give an overview of how things work today. Keep in mind, although it will become immediately obvious, that this is absolutely a work in progress and subject to change. Please leave feedback in the comments section and don't hold back. I am emotionally detached from my work. All I care about is achieving the goal and making things better. Alright, let's get into it. Open your favorite browser and head over to mvpm.tools. When you first arrive, you'll be greeted with an empty void. In the sidebar, a section dedicated to listing your projects is begging for attention. Press the Add button and provide a name for your first project. It'll automatically load up once you're done. Something to keep in mind, everything is saved locally in your browser at the moment using local storage. I'm contemplating some persistence to the cloud, but I need to consider the financial implications of that. For now, just remember your data is stored on your device in your browser's local storage, which means you won't be able to see it across devices or browsers. There is an autosave feature, which by default is on. You can toggle it off if you prefer to save manually. This might come in handy if you're sandboxing or experimenting and you don't want to overwrite your legitimate configuration. Let's dismiss the sidebar, since we won't need it. We can summon it later if we want. On desktops with enough screen space, the layout is 2 columns. On compact form factors, it'll be a single column. Let's focus on the larger form factor layout, since it's probably the most ergonomic. On the left side is data, and on the right is data entry. Right now, the data side of an empty project might look a bit confusing. I'll work on that, but for now, let's look at a project mid-flight. We'll start with the data. On the top is the project burn-up, a simple visualization plotting work completed against work remaining over time. Actual values from completed iterations, also known as sprints or cycles, are represented as these little bars. The bottom value in the more prominent color represents work completed. The top value in the less prominent color represents work remaining. The trend lines predict the future based on past performance, factoring in a variety of considerations which we'll get to later. I recently posted a video explaining burn-ups, so check it out if you haven't already, or if you're just not familiar with the concept. Underneath the chart is a set of metrics carefully selected to help make sense of the current and possible future situation in your project. Let's go through them one by one. The last achievement metric tells you how many story points were completed in the most recent iteration. Velocity is the average achievement across all iterations completed so far. Next achievement is a prediction of how many story points the team might achieve in the next iteration based on past performance, availability, and the moving average period. Again, more on those variables later. Expenditure is the current budget expenditure so far. Estimated finish is the projected completion date based on the team's velocity. Looking at the burn-up chart, the expected completion date corresponds with the point at which the progress and remaining projection lines meet. Estimated cost is the projected total cost of the project up until that estimated completion date. Beside this figure is a delta indicating the difference between the estimated cost and the project budget. Green text with a downwards facing arrow means the project is looking to finish up below budget. Red text with an upward facing arrow is not so good, indicating a likely completion in excess of the budget. That's just about everything in the data section. The intent is to give you at-a-glance information about how the team has been performing and what can reasonably be expected about future performance. It's also designed to be shared. Personally, I like to send regular updates to stakeholders containing a screenshot of this information, along with a snapshot of the backlog and my current take on any risks and/or impediments. Moving over to the data entry side now, this section is currently spread across a number of tabs: timeline, team, commitment, iterations, and controls. Over in timeline, we can see that this project starts on the first Monday of the calendar year, the 3rd of January 2022, and finishes on the first Monday of the financial year, at least in Australia, the 4th of July 2022. It has 14 calendar days per iteration. Again, you might be familiar with the term sprint or cycle, so you might say we're working in fortnightly sprints or 2-week cycles. And the baseline number of hours every team member is expected to work per iteration is 80. That's a 40-hour week multiplied by 2. The design of this screen might change in the future, but the idea behind the Timeline tab is that it contains all the time-based information, the time span of the project and the length of the iterations that are spread across that time span. In the Team tab, we see roles and team members defined. Roles have a name, and they have an hourly rate for budgeting purposes. The rocket emoji next to each role is actually the world's most confusing checkbox. It determines whether or not velocity calculations will include work contributed by team members in this role. More on that in a moment. Team members have a name and a role assigned, and that's it. We can add roles and team members with the add buttons underneath each section, and records can also be deleted with the little red X. In our example, the developer role is $200 an hour and is a velocity contributing role. The designer role is $220 an hour and is a velocity non-contributing role. We've decided in this project that design work, as opposed to development work, although absolutely essential, does not count as a tangible, deliverable artifact. It's also sufficiently different from development work that the story point estimates would be incompatible and, if we were to combine them, would make our velocity projections very confusing. In terms of team composition, we currently have 2 team members. Skylark is our developer, and Rod is our world-class designer. Over in the Commitment tab, we can see budget and time tracking related concerns. The project budget is $300,000. Underneath that is a delta indicating whether the current time commitment is above or below the budget. That time commitment is managed in the table below, where we record the hours that our team members will work, or in retrospect, have worked, per iteration. There's also an option to account for non-billable hours in our project, and this setting is on by default. It comes in handy when you have team members who simply aren't billable for some portion of the project, but it's also useful for team members who have a tendency to work non-billable overtime. Now, I'm not here to encourage or discourage overtime, each to their own after all, but when it comes to tracking velocity, understanding how much work is going into the outcomes being produced is absolutely essential. Velocity is speed and direction, and speed is distance over time. Distance is story points completed, and time is conceivably the number of hours, or minutes or seconds, that went into achieving those story points. If you're only tracking the billable portion of hours worked, and your team is secretly working twice that many hours, then as soon as they stop working so much overtime, your velocity is going to inexplicably drop. Now, I posted a very, very large article at lambdaspire.com/articles over-explaining my views on velocity, so I won't go into too much detail here. Check it out if you're interested, but suffice it to say that MVPM Tools allows you to distinguish billable and non-billable hours as a mechanism to account for non-billable overtime without sacrificing accuracy in your velocity projections. So in our example, we can see that Skylark has put in some non-billable overtime here and there already. If we remove that overtime, we see that the projections in the burn-up chart change, and the metrics based on velocity also change. Historical data relating to budget expenditure, however, does not change. We can also see that the team was absent for 1 week during iteration 3. When calculating velocity, what's happening is the tool is determining the average points completed per velocity contributing hour worked. It then applies that calculation to the future commitment. To demonstrate this, let's pretend that Skylark is going on holiday for a month and set their iteration 7 and 8 commitments to 0. Because Skylark's role is the only velocity contributing role in the team, you'll notice that the burn-up chart flatlines the expected achievement for those 2 iterations to 0. Incidentally, the progress and remaining projections no longer intersect, and the estimated finish date is never. I'll undo those changes and move on. One more thing to note, the number of iterations available is determined by the timeline. In this example, the project spans from the beginning of January to the beginning of July. That's 182 days divided by 14-day iterations, which equals 13 iterations in total. The iteration numbers in the UI start at 0 because some teams like to do what they call a sprint 0. I'll be making this configurable in the future, so please just bear with it for now. Now, speaking of iterations, let's move on to the Iterations tab. This is where we record the story point achievement and work remaining for every completed iteration. You'll see completed iterations appear more prominently than incomplete ones. and this is actually the same as on the Commitment tab. Completing an iteration is as simple as supplying the achievement and remaining values to the table. Doing so will automatically update the chart and metrics with the newly completed iteration's data taken into account. In our example, we've completed from iteration 0 up to iteration 6. In iteration 0, we completed 40 points with 460 remaining. In iteration 1, we completed a further 35 points for a total of 75 completed, but still with 440 remaining. This represents a growth in the backlog size. You can see that the growing and shrinking of the backlog continues in the remaining completed iterations. Beyond the range of completed iterations, the projection lines take over, giving us an indication of what's to come based on what's happened in the past. The nature of these projection lines can be controlled in none other than the Controls tab. In addition to the option to delete the project, which is hopefully quite obvious, the Controls tab configures the moving average period of both the progress and remaining projection lines. This is how many iterations backward to aggregate across when calculating projected values. By default, the value is 3 for both, so that means when calculating iteration 7, we'll consider iterations 4, 5, and 6. When calculating iteration 8, we'll consider iterations 5, 6, and 7. This inherently means using projected values as part of the projection, and the estimations about the future are built up on a whole bunch of assumptions about past performance indicating future performance. In my experience, at any point in time, the last 3 iterations are a pretty good indicator of the team's emerging behaviors and performance, and that's why 3 is the default. As an example, if scope creep is starting to become a factor, there's a good chance that it may continue into the near term. When it comes to velocity, teams typically accelerate across the lifespan of a project. Clearing the values will default them to infinity, which means that all previous values will be included when calculating the projection. If you want to simply use the most recent iteration's value for either projection, set the period to 1. Alternatively, if you want to flatline the projection, set the period to 0. Now, obviously, flatlining the progress projection doesn't make a lot of sense. However, flatlining the remaining projection could give an indication that the team has committed to cracking down on scope creep, for example, maintaining the same amount of work for the foreseeable future. Proceed with caution. In a truly agile environment, the backlog is almost inevitably going to change, and past behavior is usually a pretty good indicator of future behavior. That said, these options do exist to help augment the presentation of the data to help you achieve your communication, transparency, and perhaps even diplomacy objectives. Remember though, the goal is to be honest, at the very least with yourself as the project manager, but also ideally with the stakeholders. The truth, after all, will set you free. Maybe. That's about all I want to demonstrate in this video. You're probably tired of my voice. I know I am, so let's just stop there. There is more to talk about, but at this stage I feel those topics are less about the tools themselves and more about utilizing the tools effectively in specific project management scenarios. I'll be making more videos on those topics, so if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.